The chamber is frozen in silence. The marble walls of the Supreme Court seem to echo with the weight of history itself, as if the nation's heartbeat has slowed, waiting for one sentence that will decide its future. Every pair of eyes in the room is locked forward. The justices sit elevated, their black robes billowing like shadows of destiny. The audience leans in, pens poised, cameras flashing faintly, breaths held in collective anticipation. Then it happens. A single voice pierces. The stillness, calm but thunderous in its consequence. Donald J. Trump is hereby disqualified from holding the office of President of the United States. Gasps ripple across the courtroom. Some jaws drop in disbelief. Others tremble with joy. The sound of muffled cries mixes with the frantic tapping of reporters, their devices lighting up as alerts race across the nation. Screens from coast to coast flicker with breaking headlines. The words bold and unmistakable. Trump banned from presidency. Supreme Court rules. The silence breaks into a storm of reactions. In the gallery, some clutch their chests as if they've just witnessed a miracle. Their storm out, their faces twisted with rage. The roar of crowds waiting on the courthouse steps swells like a tidal wave chants of triumph clashing against cries of fury. America is split in two, yet bound by one undeniable truth. History has just been rewritten. And in living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces across the country, millions stop in their tracks. Phones buzz endlessly, notifications piling up. Family. Group chats explode. Strangers exchange stunned glances on subway platforms. In a single sentence, the Supreme Court ended Trump's presidency forever. But as the world tries to process what has just happened, another question lingers in the air, electric and unshakable. How did we get here? Because this moment, this seismic ruling that reshaped the nation's political landscape, wasn't born in marble chambers alone. It began with a voice, bold and unflinching. A freshman congresswoman who refused to be silenced. A woman who carried the fire of her district into the heart of Washington, daring to confront the powerful and demand accountability when no one else would. Her name, Jasmine Crockett. And while millions today celebrate this decision as the fall of Trump, it is also the rise of a new kind of political force, one that few saw coming. But who is Jasmine Crockett, and how did she ignite the chain of events that led to this historic ruling? The answer is as dramatic as the verdict itself. Donald Trump's 2024 comeback bid was unlike anything America had ever seen. It wasn't just a campaign, it was a storm, a whirlwind of rallies, lawsuits, indictments, and defiance. His supporters, unwavering and fiery, flooded arenas chanting his name as though he were still the sitting president. To them, he was the rightful leader, wronged by a system they claimed was rigged. But to millions of others, his return to the political stage was a nightmare. A threat that felt like déjà vu laced with something darker, because this time, the chaos wasn't hypothetical. This time, it was happening in real time. The headlines screamed daily updates, criminal trials looming, civil suits mounting, investigations stacking like dominoes teetering toward collapse. Yet none of it seemed to stop him. If anything, Trump wielded his legal troubles as political fuel, spinning indictments into proof of his martyrdom. His defiance energized his base, terrified his opponents, and left the country trapped in a suffocating spiral of what if. Wait, what if he won again? What if the institutions designed to hold him accountable failed once more? Enter Jasmine Crockett, Congresswoman from Texas, still early in her political career, but already known for her razor-sharp tongue and fearless confrontations in hearings. Crockett wasn't content with watching the legal circus unfold from the sidelines. While others whispered about waiting for the courts or letting the voters decide, Crockett understood the stakes were far too high. She had studied the Constitution, pored over its forgotten clauses, and found the weapon no one else dared to wield. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. It was blunt, unapologetic, and written for precisely a moment like this. Any person who engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States was barred from holding public office. No trial for treason required. No need for elaborate loopholes. It's just a simple truth etched into America's founding document after the Civil War reels do not get to rule. Crockett seized it. With fiery speeches and relentless advocacy, she demanded Trump be held to the same standard. He had not only stoked the January 6th insurrection, she argued he had incited it, embraced it, and even promised pardons for those who carried it out. To ignore that, she said, would be to betray the very Constitution every elected official swore to uphold. The stakes could not have been higher. If Trump prevailed, if he managed to bulldoze through the legal maelstrom and reclaim the White House, the fragile democracy of the United States could fracture beyond repair. Allies abroad would lose faith. Extremists at home would feel emboldened. The message to history would be chilling, that power once seized could never be checked, not even by the law itself. But if Crockett's strategy succeeded, she and her allies could convince the courts to enforce the 14th Amendment. It would not just end Trump's comeback. It would set a precedent that no leader, no matter how powerful, could rise above the Constitution. It would be a triumph not just for one party, but for the very idea of America. And yet, Crockett knew exactly what she was walking into. She wasn't just challenging Trump the man, just challenging Trump the movement, the billionaire-backed machine, the media empire, the cult of personality that had redefined the Republican Party itself. The risk was staggering. The backlash was guaranteed. But she pressed forward, undaunted, because in her mind, history doesn't wait for the timid. What happened next would pit her against the most powerful man in Republican history on a battlefield that stretched from Congress to the courts and eventually to the marble steps of the Supreme Court itself. Donald Trump was never a man who bowed to defeat. To him, losing was unthinkable, a stain that could not exist on the carefully polished brand of power he had built for decades. In his mind, every setback was a conspiracy, every critic a traitor, every loss a theft. So when the 2020 election ended with him on the wrong side of history, he did not concede. Instead, he transformed denial into spectacle, reshaping his downfall into the grand narrative of a martyr. His rallies returned with a vengeance. Gone were the triumphant anthems of 2016. Now the music was darker, more urgent, almost apocalyptic. Supporters waved their flags not just in celebration but in defiance, as though they were soldiers in a war to reclaim a stolen crown. Trump, standing tall on his stage, painted himself as both victim and savior, the man the establishment feared. The warrior chosen to battle shadowy elites who supposedly rigged the system against him. "They're not after me," he thundered. Into the microphone, his voice dripping with grievance and fire. "They're after you. I'm just standing in the way." The crowd erupted, chanting his name as if he alone could deliver them from betrayal. It was political theater of the highest order, and Trump knew his lines well. Every insult hurled at prosecutors, every jab at the media, every sneer toward Democrats fed into the image he cultivated. A man too strong to be broken, too rich to be bought, too bold to be silenced. But beneath the bravado lay hypocrisy. Trump, the self-proclaimed champion of the forgotten man, lived in gilded palaces and moved within circles of wealth and privilege that most of his supporters would never touch. He railed against corruption while leveraging his own businesses to funnel donor money back into his empire. He portrayed himself as a fighter for truth, yet lied with such frequency and confidence that even his allies privately admitted they struggled to keep up with his fabrications. His refusal to accept loss was less about patriotism and more about ego. An obsession with control so consuming that the idea of stepping aside was intolerable. When the courtroom battles began, he treated them not as reckonings, but as stages. Walking into hearings, he glared at cameras, jaw set, chin tilted upward as though daring the system to challenge him. His lawyers spun arguments that bordered on farce. But Trump didn't care about legal victories as much as the optics of defiance. To his followers, every indictment became proof of persecution, every charge another badge of honor. He taunted judges, smeared prosecutors, and cast juries as pawns in a grand conspiracy while raising millions off his supposed suffering. The arrogance was breathtaking. Trump carried himself like a king who believed the throne was his by divine right, not by vote. He demanded loyalty oaths, scolded those who wavered, and kept his party in line through intimidation. Republican. Leaders who dared to challenge him quickly found themselves exiled, mocked, or politically destroyed. Fear was his weapon, and for a time, it worked. Yet arrogance, when unchecked, has a way of curdling into weakness. The very qualities that once made Trump untouchable began to erode his grip. His endless grievances turned wearisome even to some. Of his base, his refusal to admit fault left him exposed, unable to adapt when legal strategies demanded humility. His intimidation tactics, once effective, started to resemble desperation. Behind the curtain of strength was a man cornered, flailing, against inevitability. As the trials mounted, his theatrics grew louder, more unhinged. He painted prosecutors as thugs, judges as traitors, and even hinted at pardons for those who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. It was a chilling reminder that his loyalty was not to the Constitution but to himself. The system that had once enabled his rise was now being tested by his defiance, and cracks were beginning to show. Trump believed his wealth, his fame, and his relentless willpower would shield him. He believed that if he projected enough strength, if he shouted loudly enough, the walls closing in would crumble. But history tells a different story. Power built on intimidation is fragile. Empires built on lies collapse under their own weight, and so the stage was set. Trump, the master of spectacle, stood at the center of the storm he had created, convinced that the chaos proved his invincibility. But in truth, every rally, every sneer, every insult had only tightened the noose. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin in the marble halls of Washington, but in the heart of Texas, where grit and resilience are woven into everyday life. Raised in a working-class family, she learned early what it meant to fight for dignity in a world that often seemed stacked against people like her. The lessons of her childhood were simple but enduring. Speak truth, even when it trembles in your throat. Defend the vulnerable, even when it costs you. And never, ever let anyone convince you that silence is safer than justice. Before she ever took an oath of office, Crockett carried that fire into the courtroom as a public defender. The cases were endless, the pay almost nothing. But for her, the work was never about comfort. It was about standing beside those whom society preferred to forget: the poor, the marginalized, the people who didn't have a lobbyist or a lawyer on speed dial. She saw firsthand the machinery of inequality grinding down those at the bottom. She refused to let them be crushed without someone shouting in their defense. The sacrifices were real. There were nights she went without sleep, mornings that bled into hearings after barely enough rest to stand. There were bills that went unpaid, moments when friends and even family asked if the fight was worth it. But Crockett believed it was. Each courtroom appearance, each client defended, was another reminder that her purpose was larger than herself. That sense of purpose followed her into politics. When she won a seat in Congress, she didn't step into the role quietly. She arrived. With the same unapologetic defiance that had defined her career as a lawyer, on Capitol Hill, where so many are trained to temper their words, Crockett's voice cut through like steel. She was sharp, unflinching, and precise. In committee hearings, she mastered the art of dismantling opponents not with volume, but with clarity. When she spoke, her words landed like hammer strikes, concise, irrefutable, impossible to ignore. And yet, the price of visibility for a black woman in power was steep. The attacks came fast, dripping with racism and sexism, sometimes blunt, sometimes cloaked in polite language but no less vicious. She was labeled angry for raising her voice, professional for dressing boldly, divisive for daring to demand accountability from the powerful. Commentators mocked her hair, her tone, even her very presence. But Crockett did not flinch. Each insult became fuel, each attempt to diminish her only proof that she was striking nerves in places of entrenched power. What her detractors saw as anger was truth, clarity. She refused to allow gaslighting or political theater to obscure the facts. In hearings, she became known for her precision, cutting through hours of partisan noise with a single sentence that silenced the room. Clips of her exchanges with political opponents went viral, not just because of the drama, because people recognized authenticity when they saw it. She was not a polished actor reciting talking points. She was a truth-teller who refused to back down, and truth, for Crockett, was never abstract, was lived. She carried the weight of constituents back home in Texas, people who wanted someone in Washington to say what they themselves screamed at their televisions. She embodied the pride of communities that had been told for generations that their voices did not matter. For them, seeing her on the floor of Congress was more than representation, it was vindication. Still, her rise was not without scars. Crockett endured endless nights away from home, constant threats to her safety, and the draining pressure of being expected to represent not just her district, but an entire generation of women and people of color who saw themselves in her. There were moments of exhaustion, moments when the fight felt impossible. But every time she questioned if she could go on, she thought of the oath she took not to a party, not to a position, but to the Constitution itself. It was that oath that would guide her to the most audacious stand of her career. When others shrugged off Trump's return as politics as usual, Crockett saw the danger with crystal clarity. She knew the cost of ignoring corruption, the peril of allowing arrogance to masquerade as leadership, and she knew that the Constitution already held the answer in its bones, the 14th Amendment. While colleagues debated strategy, Crockett acted. She built alliances, studied legal precedent, and raised her voice in chambers where silence would have been easier. She wasn't afraid of being the first to demand that Trump be held accountable under the clause that barred insurrectionists from office. Where others saw risk, she saw responsibility. Her resolve was magnetic. Activists rallied around her. Constitutional scholars echoed her arguments. Ordinary citizens found in her the courage they wished their leaders possessed. But with each step forward, the opposition grew fiercer. Death threats arrived in her office. Conservative media branded her a radical. Trump himself mocked her from his podiums. None of it shook her, because Crockett's fight was never about personal glory. It was about principle. About proving that the law once written must be lived. About ensuring that future generations would not look back on this era and wonder why no one had the courage to stand up when democracy was under siege. And so, as the battle lines sharpened, Crockett prepared herself for the confrontation that would define not just her career, but her legacy. She had weathered poverty, sexism, racism, and political scorn. She had stood against a tide of arrogance and lies. And now every lesson, every scar, every ounce of resilience had led her to this moment. The Supreme Court chamber was electric, thick with tension that seemed to vibrate through the marble columns. Every seat was filled, every gaze locked on the spectacle unfolding before the nation. For all the grandeur of the room, it felt less like a dignified hearing and more like a battlefield. One where words were the weapons and history the prize. Trump's lawyers struck first, leaning hard into mockery. They smirked, their voices dripping with disdain as they dismissed Crockett's case as nothing more than political theater. One attorney, pacing with exaggerated swagger, declared, "This is not a constitutional argument. It's a partisan stunt dressed up as law." Congresswoman Crockett is not protecting democracy. She is staging a performance to silence the will of the American people. The words were calculated to sting, to undermine her credibility, to reduce her into a caricature. Laughter, sharp and nervous, rippled from the gallery of Trump loyalists. But Crockett's team didn't flinch. Rising with calm precision, her allies laid out the case brick by brick. They cited historical precedents from the post-Civil War era. When the 14th Amendment was invoked against Confederates who sought to reclaim power, they presented evidence of Trump's actions on January 6, not just his incendiary words, but his refusal to intervene as violence consumed the Capitol. They replayed his promises to pardon insurrectionists, his praise for rioters as patriots. Each point landed with quiet devastation, harder to swat away than the bluster Trump's lawyers unleashed. The contrast was striking. Trump's side relied on volume, sneers, and theatrics. Crockett's side offered clarity, conviction, and the weight of the Constitution itself. Slowly, the laughter faded, replaced by the sharp scratching of pens as reporters scrambled to capture every word the justices pressed in, their questions cutting to the bone. One asked Trump's lawyer, "Are you suggesting the 14th Amendment does not apply to a sitting president who engages in insurrection?" The lawyer stammered, retreating into evasions about political questions and letting voters decide. Another justice turned to Crockett's counsel. "If we accept your argument, what? Are we not ensuring that no one, not even the president, stands above the law?" The answer came swift, confident. That is exactly the promise the Constitution makes, and it is a promise we must honor. As the exchanges grew sharper, Trump himself shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The man who thrived on spectacle was suddenly stripped of control. Here, in this chamber, he could not storm off stage, could not command chants or drown out critics with insults. The rules of the court bound him, forcing him to sit to listen, to endure. His lips tightened, his hands clasped and unclasped, and for the first time, the mask of bravado slipped into visible frustration. Murmurs rippled through the chamber as the gravity of the arguments sank in. Each side was playing not just to the justices, but to the millions watching through breaking news updates, live streams, and viral clips. Outside, the crowd roared with dueling chants, "Trump forever," clashing against "Protect democracy." There, echoes faint but ever present in the hallowed space of the court. The drama reached a fever pitch. Trump's lawyers doubled down, accusing Crockett of weaponizing the Constitution for political gain. "If the court allows this," one lawyer thundered, "then every election from now on will be decided not by the people, but by partisan lawsuits. This is a dangerous precedent that will unravel democracy itself." Crockett's side rose again, undeterred. Their lead attorney's voice cut through the noise with piercing calm. "The danger lies not in enforcing the Constitution, but in abandoning it. If we pretend that the 14th Amendment is optional, then we concede that insurrection is no longer disqualifying. That precedent does not unravel democracy, it buries it." The chamber fell into silence, words hanging like a verdict no one wanted to speak aloud. Tension curled tighter with every exchange, as though the chamber itself were holding its breath. Trump shifted again, his face flushed, eyes darting toward the bench where the justices leaned forward, pressing for answers. The gallery sat frozen, each moment heavier than the last, and then, as the back and forth reached its breaking point, Crockett herself rose. She had been silent through much of the theatrics, letting her team build the case piece by piece. Now, every head turned toward her, every camera lens fixed. As she prepared to speak directly into the heart of the storm, the chamber had grown restless. A cauldron of half-muttered whispers, scribbling pens, and nervous glances between justices and clerks. For hours, Trump's lawyers had hurled mockery and derision, sneering at the 14th Amendment, as if it were a relic too brittle to matter in the modern age. For hours, Crockett's side had answered with precedent, with evidence, with the Constitution itself. But now, all of it seemed to coalesce into this moment, the instant when the congresswoman who had started this fight would deliver the strike no one could anticipate. "Jasmine?" Crockett rose slowly, her poise deliberate, her silence commanding. She didn't rush, she didn't flail. She simply allowed the gravity of her presence to settle over the room until every cough, every shuffle of paper, every nervous tick was swallowed by stillness. She clasped her notes, then set them down untouched. When she finally spoke, her voice carried not the shrillness of anger, but the weight of certainty. "Let us be very clear," she began, her words measured, almost surgical. "This is not about politics. This is not about party. It's about whether the Constitution means what it says, whether it is nothing more than decoration." The simplicity of the line cut through the fog of rhetoric like a blade. A hush deepened. Even the justices leaned forward, as if pulled by the gravitational force of her conviction. Crockett paused, letting the silence amplify her point before. Continuing, "Trump's lawyers want you to believe this is theater. But tell me, was it theater, when thousands of his supporters stormed this very nation's capital at his urging? Was it theater when blood was spilled in these halls? When police officers begged for their lives? When gallows were erected outside and rioters chanted, "Hang Mike Pence"? Was it theater when the commander-in-chief, instead of defending? The country sat in silence, watching chaos on television, delighting in the violence he had unleashed. Her voice sharpened. No, that was not theater. It was insurrection. The word landed like thunder. Ripples surged across the gallery, murmurs, gasps, even a stifled cry. Trump shifted in his seat, his face tightening, his hand fidgeting. Against the table, the cameras caught it. The country saw it. For the first time in years, Donald Trump did not look untouchable. He looked cornered. Crockett pressed on, steady as a scalpel. The 14th Amendment is not ambiguous. Section 3 does not say, except for presidents. It does not say except for powerful men. It does not say except for those who claim persecution. It says clearly, if you engage in insurrection, you are barred from office. Period. She turned briefly, gesturing toward Trump without ever lowering herself to speak his name. The defense would have you believe that this is about disenfranchising voters. But what they conveniently ignore is that the Constitution itself is the highest expression of the people's will. It was ratified to protect democracy from precisely this scenario. A man who betrays his oath, who sides with rebellion, who weaponizes violence to cling to power. The justices watched her intently. Some took notes furiously. Others simply stared as though memorizing her cadence. Outside the chamber, the crowd pressed closer to the barricades, straining to hear through live streams. In snippets on social media, millions of Americans were riveted to screens, scrolling interrupted by the gravity of this moment. Crockett's voice dropped lower, deliberate, almost intimate. Trump's lawyers call this a witch hunt. But what kind of witch hunt is it? When the witches confess on camera, we all saw it. We all heard it. The speech on January 6th was not vague. It was not coded. He told them to march. He told them to fight like hell. He told them their country was being stolen, and he promised to stand with them. And then, as the mob stormed the Capitol, he refused every plea to intervene. This is not speculation. This is history. Gallery sat motionless. Even Trump's staunchest allies in the room glanced uneasily at one another. For once, their rehearsed bravado faltered. Crockett leaned in, her tone now steel wrapped in fire. And so I ask this court, if January 6th does not qualify as an insurrection, what does? If the President of the United States inciting violence? To overturn an election does not meet the threshold, then the 14th Amendment is meaningless ink on paper. And if this court cannot enforce that, then democracy itself is already dead. Her words echoed like a tolling bell. Trump's breathing quickened, his jaw clenched. The cameras zoomed in on his flushed face, on the rare sight of a man visibly shaken, and then she delivered the smoking gun. With deliberate calm, Crockett lifted a printed transcript and held it aloft. This is not interpretation. This is his own statement. On January 6th, after the mob had breached the Capitol, he tweeted, quote, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously, viciously stripped away. Go home with love and in peace. Remember, this day forever." She lowered the page. He told them to remember. He glorified it. That is not the language of remorse. That is the language of allegiance, as not defending the Constitution. The gavel struck, and with it, history bent in real time. The Supreme Court's ruling thundered through the chamber. Words that would be repeated in textbooks, documentaries, and dinner table conversations for generations. Donald J. Trump was disqualified from holding the office of President of the United States. The sentence landed like an earthquake, and the aftershocks rippled instantly across the nation and the world. Within seconds, phones buzzed and screens lit up. Notifications piled endlessly. Breaking news banners plastered across every network, anchors stumbling over their own words as they tried to capture the enormity of the moment. On Twitter, hashtags blazed into existence, climbing faster than anyone could track. Hashtag Crockett crushes Trump. Hashtag democracy wins. Hashtag never again. Millions of posts poured in, some jubilant, some furious, all electrified by the realization that the impossible had just become reality. In living rooms across America, families gathered in stunned silence before erupting in tears of joy. A grandmother in Detroit clutched her granddaughter's hand, whispering, "We live to see it. We live to see justice." A teacher in Arizona recorded herself crying as she told her students, "This is what accountability looks like." Strangers hugged in subway stations, their phones streaming the ruling. The country, fractured for so long, found small pockets of unity, not in agreement, but in the shared acknowledgement that something irreversible had just happened. Politicians scrambled to respond. Democrats, many long cautious about taking too sharp a stance, rushed to claim vindication. Speeches were delivered on courthouse steps, voices raised in celebration of the Constitution's resilience. Today, democracy triumphed. One senator declared, "And no man, no matter how powerful, is above the law." Republicans splintered in their reactions, some doubling down on Trump's martyrdom, others quietly distancing themselves, eyes already shifting toward a post-Trump future. Celebrities weighed in, their platforms amplifying the moment to billions. Actors, musicians, and athletes shared videos of themselves cheering, their voices echoing the sentiments of their fans. International figures followed suit. Leaders in Europe hailed the decision as proof that American institutions could still withstand authoritarianism. Activists in countries battling their own strongmen pointed to Crockett as a beacon. "The U.S. has shown us that constitutions are not ornamental," one South American leader tweeted. "They are shields for democracy." And through it all, the name Jasmine Crockett surged like a tidal wave. She had been underestimated, dismissed as a freshman congresswoman too bold for her own good. But now, her face was on every network. Her words replayed in every highlight reel. Clips of her courtroom dismantling of Trump's defense spread like wildfire memes. Remixes and heartfelt tributes saturating the internet. Children dressed up as her for school assemblies. Parents told their kids, "That's what courage looks like." The emotional undercurrent ran deeper than politics. For many, this was not about partisanship. It was about survival. Dignity, the affirmation that the Constitution had teeth. People who had marched in protests, who had been tear-gassed, who had written postcards and knocked on doors, felt for the first time that their efforts had not been in vain. Veterans wept as they saluted their television screens. Immigrants proudly waved flags in city squares, declaring that the democracy they had chosen to join had proven its strength. But with celebration came fear, too. Trump's most devoted followers erupted in fury, flooding social media with threats and defiance. Crowds gathered outside his estates, waving banners that screamed betrayal. Right-wing media declared the court illegitimate, warning of a stolen America. The victory was real, but the danger had not vanished. If anything, the ruling deepened the fracture, sharpening the divide. Still, for one shimmering moment, relief outweighed dread. Across the nation, fireworks burst into the sky. Church bells rang in small towns. Choirs sang in city parks. The sense of release, of history correcting itself, was overwhelming. And at the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, now more than a congresswoman, more than a rising star. She had become a symbol. To some, she was the woman who saved democracy. To others, the one who struck down their idol. Either way, her name would forever be tied to this ruling, etched into the annals of American history. Yet Crockett herself knew the truth that others did not. As the crowds chanted her name, as cameras sought her every movement, as her inbox overflowed with praise, she kept her composure. Because she understood something most were too swept up to see. This fight was not over. Trump had been banned, but the forces that carried him to power, the anger, the fear, the disinformation still pulsed beneath the surface of American life. In the days after the ruling, as the shockwaves settled into the soil of American life, Jasmine Crockett did something remarkable. She refused to make the victory about herself. Cameras followed her every step. Reporters pressed for sound bites about her personal triumph. But she spoke with the same measured clarity that had carried her through the storm. "This was never about me," she said softly, her eyes steady on the lenses that broadcast her words to millions. "This was about the Constitution. This was about democracy. And this was about proving that truth and justice will always outlast lies and arrogance." It was a reminder that heroes are not made by glory, but by responsibility. Crockett could have basked in the celebration, could have claimed the spotlight as her own. But instead she redirected it back to the people who had endured years of political turmoil, back to the communities who had demanded accountability, back to the timeless idea that the law belongs to everyone, not just the powerful. Her message resonated. Across the nation, ordinary citizens echoed her words in conversations with their children. In sermons at churches, in union halls and classrooms, teachers told students, "You see, the Constitution is alive because we make it alive." Parents reminded their kids, "It doesn't matter how loud the lies are. What matters is standing firm in the truth." The ruling was not framed as the defeat of one man, but as the vindication of a nation's highest ideals. Crockett's composure also revealed something deeper. Resilience is not just about fighting, but about knowing why you fight. She had endured the ridicule, the threats, the racism and sexism hurled at her along the way. And yet, when the ruling came down, she did not meet hate with vengeance. She met it with dignity. In doing so, she modeled a new kind of strength, one rooted not in domination, but in principle. The moral lesson was clear. Arrogance can build empires, but it cannot sustain them. Lies can capture attention, but they cannot endure the test of truth. And when courage steps forward, no matter how isolated, no matter how underestimated, can shift the tide of history. Americans who had felt beaten down by years of cynicism, this moment restored something fragile, yet vital belief. That the Constitution still held power. Belief that justice, though slow, was not dead. Belief that one person's voice, when raised with conviction, could silence the roar of corruption. Crockett captured it best in her final statement to the press, her words ringing with both humility and fire. In the end, one voice of courage silenced an empire of corruption. That's not my story, that's America's story. And it's the story we must keep writing, every day, together. The crescendo of her words carried far beyond the courthouse steps. They became a rallying cry for those weary of division, a reminder that democracy is not a gift but a responsibility. They became a reassurance to immigrants who had come seeking freedom, to young people who feared the system was broken, to elders who had fought for civil rights and wondered if their sacrifices had been in vain. And so, the resolution was not merely the end of Trump's presidency. It was a reaffirmation that integrity matters, that resilience matters, that standing for what is right, even when it feels impossible, always matters. Crockett's fight proved that democracy is not defended by silence, but by voices willing to rise against the storm. History had delivered its verdict. But the moral was timeless. Truth outlives falsehood, justice outlasts tyranny, and courage, when wielded by even one determined soul, can transform the fate of a nation. Trump is banned. Crockett is victorious. And history has been altered in a way that few thought possible. What began as a courtroom gamble turned into a defining moment for American democracy, a moment that proved no man, no matter how wealthy, how powerful, or how loud, is above the Constitution. But this story is not just about a courtroom or a congresswoman. It's about a say-about what we demand from those who seek to lead us, and what we are willing to defend when that leadership threatens to collapse under the weight of lies. Jasmine Crockett stood firm because she knew that silence in the face of corruption is complicity. She carried her community, her values, and her courage into the halls of power. And she reminded the world that one person's refusal to bow down can safeguard the future for millions. And now, the responsibility passes to each of us. Democracy is not self-sustaining. It requires vigilance, courage, and a willingness to act. If this ruling taught us anything, It is that justice survives only when people demand it, defend it, and refuse to surrender it to arrogance or fear. So, here is your call. Reflect on what this moment means. Talk about it with your family. Carry it into your classrooms, your workplaces, your communities. And if you believe in standing up to power and protecting democracy, join us. Subscribe, share, and keep this fight alive. Because today, it was Jasmine Crockett who made history. Tomorrow, it could be you adding your voice to the chorus of those who refuse to back down. Together, we are the guardians of justice. We write the next chapter of America's story. LDED by even one determined soul can transform the fate of a nation.